Oh, good and gracious God, as we come before you this morning, I pray that you have prepared me for this moment and given me the words that you want spoken to fall upon the hearts of your people, Lord. And I pray that our worship will be pleasing in your sight, that it is in Jesus' name that I pray. Amen. The first thing I wanted to say is, I don't know how I forgot it, but our Lenten services continue. This Wednesday we will be here at St. John, and if you want to see the people at Zion and also hear from Pastor Jim Duncan, please come. At 7 o'clock we meet. Those services have been going very well, and they've just really been, to me, very meaningful. So today, and I don't know if you knew this, but it's largely thanks to John's gospel and Jesus' regular pilgrimages going to Jerusalem that we know that his ministry was 3 years in duration, or approximately 3 years. Specifically, John records Jesus attending 3 separate Passover observances in Jerusalem in the temple. And your homework assignment, should you choose to accept it, is to find out where in John's gospel these 3 Passovers are mentioned. What are the chapter and verse? Now, the temple itself, this is the high holy place of the Jewish people, the great temple. This was where people would come, where a sinful humanity would intersect with a holy God, Yahweh, and receive his blessings. And what we see today instead is what's on display here is the machinery of the temple that had more or less taken over the dominant purpose, or the focus, you could say, of what was to go on there. This great spiritual sanctuary had now become essentially bedlam and chaos, bustling with animals for sale, and people making sacrifices, had to go to the money changers and deal with them to get their money exchanged, because I don't know if you knew this, but pagan money couldn't be used conveniently at the temple. They reasoned it this way. They said Roman coins had Caesar's image on it. Caesar said he was a god. Therefore, it was idolatrous to use that kind of money. And it wasn't necessarily these things, again, the sacrifices or the money changers, that were a problem in a normal sense, but the machinery had become such that the temple had primarily become a business unto itself. Okay? Another way to say it is that in the temple, this business of the machinery was worshiped more than God. And what the people were receiving was a message. Maybe it wasn't, put out there for everybody to hear on a big sign, but the message implied was you have to pay a price if you want to go and meet with God, rather than the message that was supposed to be was that God paid the price to come and to meet us. Do you see how harmful and subtle this kind of stuff becomes? And this has happened throughout history. It happened in the Middle Ages during Luther's time. The church begins to sell all kinds of goods and services, even the right to spring your loved ones from purgatory by purchasing, if you will, an indulgence or two. That was done in order to raise as much money for the grand church in Rome as possible. And I don't want us to think that our modern day churches are exempt. We all too easily can put things in the place of where we're supposed to be. We can take pride, for example, in our programs, our wonderful programs, or our mission outreach. My, aren't we good at that? Over and above our emphasis, and our purpose, which is to worship God in fullness and truth. To have that personal relationship with Christ. And dare I say, in the Lutheran Church, we have tended oftentimes to worship what we would call right doctrine, okay? And we get more into this head stuff, and sometimes we lose it. We forget about the heart and what that means. And as this text moves on, that I read for you today, the Jewish authorities of the day, most likely it was Pharisees and Sadducees, they raised the question as to what authority or credentials Jesus has, to demand, the removal of these animals and money changers, and for Jesus to respond in holy anger with this whip of cords that he puts together to drive the offenders away. They're basically saying, if you're going to do something like this, you darn well better have the power behind you that a prophet does. And we need to see some signs from God if you're going to usurp this system that we have put into place here. So Jesus offers up a sign. Nobody gets it. Nobody understands at that point. But he says, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I'll raise it up. Now we know in hindsight, on the other side of the resurrection, that he was talking about his body. Okay? They took it to mean the physical structure of the temple. It had taken 46 long years to build that temple, and it still was unfinished at that point. But something very important happens here in the midst of all of this, and that's why these verses are up there that you see. In verse 21, we're told that the disciples did something. They remembered that Jesus had said this, and then they believed the Scriptures. That's the entire purpose of why John is writing his gospel, so that people would come to believe. And we call that also, by the way, a foreshadowing, something that is happening in light of, or at the current moment, in light of something that is more important that's going to happen in the future. And in one sense, you could say this: Jesus was cleaning house. In that sense, that's what Lent is all about. I want us to really think about that and focus on that, boiling things down to what in the world is essential anyway about our faith. And I think we should want to think about cleaning our own house, which we're told in Scripture is our temple is our body. And we remember today what the church is all about. We didn't come here today. I hope nobody came here wanting to somehow make God like you, thinking that you're coming here. We're coming here to humble ourselves, to worship, to lift up and revere our God. And in so doing, we receive the secondary blessings of God that he bestows to his beloved. But in the process, we should be trying to move everything else, every other barrier out of the way. That's what I really see Lent as doing in a big general sense. And this the incredible spiritual insight that comes out of all of this is that, and it may not seem like so much to you, but for the people standing there, it was going to be no longer that great, massive temple that was going to be the center of worship. Now it was going to be in the person standing before them. Jesus is replacing the temple. That's part of all of this that's taking place there. And by the way, there was only one reason for you to go up to Jerusalem back then when you lived far away, and that was to go to the temple. It served, after all, as the heart and center of the Jewish faith. It's where God, I said, meets humanity. So they're not going to a party here. The text tells us that Jesus went up. And the meaning isn't symbolic here. Jerusalem was 2,500 feet above sea level. And so if you were coming from Galilee, you would typically go through the Jordan River and pass through Jericho, which is the lowest place on earth. And it looked something like what you see on the screen there. There were switchbacks. It was 17 long miles, if you can imagine walking it. It was almost straight up, arduous kind of a journey. And geographically, it set the tone for what was going to happen there at the temple. What Jesus sees when he comes there and he arrives at the temple is a total lack of respect for God. The whole meaning of the Passover, it was being compromised. And one of the things we need to understand here today about this text is the Passover meant something to people back then. Every good Jewish family, when it came to the Passover, would stop and utterly, completely cleanse their house. Every single part of it, every nook and cranny, every corner. It's where the tradition of spring cleaning came from, okay? And There you go. I realize that's a little bit maybe of a sexist picture there, but at any rate, that's a picture of spring cleaning, right? So this is what the Jewish people were doing, and this is where this came from. And when Jesus arrives, not only is his Father's house not cleansed, it is ultimately it's been made much worse. If you can imagine the animals running around there, the smell, the stench, the dirt, the dung. A lot of you out there, you have animals. You know what we're talking about here. And can you imagine taking this massive, beautiful temple, taken 46 years to build, and now you've got animals running around all through it? The key here, none of this would have been acceptable to any Jewish family at that particular time, and God's house is in disarray. It's not the first time this has happened. There's biblical precedent. You go back in the Old Testament, there's a prophet. His name is Haggai. Do you recall him? And very early on, he's calling the Jewish people out who had returned from exile and who were to rebuild the temple. But what happened was these people soon got distracted. They started building their own houses and abandoning everything else, especially the temple. And this is what God says. This is how he responds. You looked for much, but indeed it came to little. And when you brought it home, I blew it away. Why? Says the Lord of hosts, because of my house that is in ruins, while every one of you runs to his own house. Or in other words, look at what you really care about, your own house. You don't care about mine at all. That's what you see here at the Passover. Now, why was what Jesus saw before him so egregious that he wells up with this righteous kind of anger? Why would that happen? Well, I want us to understand, and we have a slide of the temple here, of kind of the layout of the temple, and you'll see that large area there, which says the court of the Gentiles. It was the largest area, the only area where something like this could have happened, where all the animals could have been with the money changers. All the other places in there were too small. And now you have to understand that there was a special meaning to this. If you were a non-Jew, a Gentile in other words, and you wanted to come to the temple to worship, this was as far as you would get as to that outer court of the Gentiles. And this is where they would begin to worship. Now they had to contend with all this chaos and bedlam going on around them. And by the way, normally Jerusalem at this time was, they thought, around 80 to 150,000 people during the Passover. It would swell sometimes to 500,000 to 800,000 people. And Josephus, the historian, Jewish historian who wrote back then, said there were even as many as 2.7 million people there. Now, it's very possible Josephus was making an estimate based on the amount of sacrifices that were being offered, but any way we look at it, there was an excessive number of people present in Jerusalem. And what were they essentially saying there at the temple? Okay, Gentiles, you know what? It's too busy for you. Come back. Come back another time. There's too much going on right now. And I want you to realize something else, that normally these money changers and these animal handlers were not there on the temple grounds. They were across the Kidron Valley on the Mount of Olives. Okay? So there's another problem surfacing in the midst of all of this. And Jesus calls it out. It's a question of their motives. First of all, it was very difficult back then if you were coming to Jerusalem to make your pilgrimage to attend there at the temple to attend the Passover. Some people came from as far away as Damascus, which today would be modern-day Syria. Okay, so it was very difficult for you to bring your sacrifice with you, whether it was a lamb, or whatever sacrifice it might be. It had to be perfect. So conveniently, when they arrived, they had to be inspected, all these sacrifices, and many of them failed. Wasn't that a nice business? Do you see how it's getting darker here the more we learn about this? And so there's actually a guy, Alfred Edersheim was his name. He wrote a book, and it was called The Life and Times of Jesus the Messiah. He talked about what happened during this time. He said, for example, if you were going to buy a sacrifice outside the temple, normally it would cost you 5 cents back then. That was 2.5 times more than its normal price. But if you went into the temple grounds, it could cost you as much as $4. Now that might not sound like a whole lot to us today, right? But if you measure it in today's terms, we're talking about in the hundreds, possibly even up to as much as $1,000 they were required to pay for this sacrifice. So Jesus responds. He fashions together a whip of cords. He drives out the livestock. He turns the tables of the money changers. I mean, imagine all the scrambling that's going on around here. And he drives the people out. I heard one pastor talk about this as a miracle in a sense that I never thought about it before, that he drove all those people out of the temple. And it's a point of interest that John actually says it or puts it in more or less of a kind way. If you read the other gospel writers, and this appears in all the other gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they have Jesus saying this: "You've turned my Father's house into a den of robbers." Now it keeps going. You see the confrontation here building between the Jewish people, and you see Jesus' response. But in the response, that somehow these leaders, they never tell Jesus to stop. They never send the temple guards, which they could have done, to arrest him or at least forcibly stop him. Like I said, they don't arrest him. In fact, I don't think there's a reason for this. I think they knew they were wrong. How do I know this? Well, if you know your scriptures back in Malachi 3, and if you know this, it's the last book of the Old Testament, right? And he's the last prophet to write. They paid attention to his words. And I want you to hear this, because after Malachi was written, God went silent for 400 years. So what is written here in Malachi? It says, "Behold, I send my messenger. He will prepare the way before me. And the Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple. And the messenger of the covenant in whom you delight, behold, he is coming, says the Lord of hosts. But who can endure the day of his coming? Who can stand when he appears? For he is like a refiner's fire and like fuller's soap. He will sit as a refiner and purifier of silver, and he will purify them like gold and silver, and they will bring offerings in righteousness to the Lord." In other words, God's coming. The Lord's coming to his temple, and it's going to be like a refiner's fire. So, what are these leaders, these Pharisees, these Sadducees, or what are they really saying? It's basically like saying, okay, you did the right thing, maybe, but why did you do it? Who told you to do that? And then you know what they asked for? They asked for a sign. And here's the question. Would a sign, you think a sign there have helped anything? A sign from Jesus? He did lots of signs. The most famous of all was going to that tomb of Lazarus. Do you remember that story? He goes there after 4 days. Lazarus has been dead. And Lazarus is coming out with all these wrappings around him, and he emerges from the tomb. What do the Pharisees and Sadducees do in response? They get mad. I just find that so ironic. You'd think that at a sign like this, the people would stop in their tracks in amazement. And they'd respond by just falling down on their knees to worship and proclaim Jesus to be the Messiah. And yet all they do is try and figure out how they're going to kill him. You see, we want signs. That doesn't mean wanting signs is a good thing. In Matthew 16, what does Jesus say? He's recorded as having said that a wicked and perverse generation wants signs, but the question is, do we need them? The last time I checked, salvation doesn't come by signs. In Romans, we're told that it is through the preaching of the word that we come to faith. In other words, You hear about Jesus because someone tells you. Faith comes by hearing. And notice Jesus does say, sign's coming, by the way, the ultimate sign. Destroy the temple, speaking of his body. In 3 days, I'm going to raise it up. It is to say, folks, my authority goes way, and I do mean way beyond this temple. I have authority over life and death. And there's something that I think Jesus is communicating to us here. He's saying, you know what? By the way, I'm not going to tolerate your irreverence. I'm not going to tolerate any falsehood. I have no desire to be half loved by you. What you all are doing out here, he says to them, is basically you're just playing church. If they were really seeking the Messiah when he came to the Passover, they would have come to at least learn, if not to worship him, to fall at his feet. Instead, when Jesus enters Jerusalem for the last time, what are they doing? They're actively making plans to seize him. And while they're at it, they're going to just take Lazarus out of the picture as well. And let me ask you this. Do you think that Jesus' cleansing of the temple had a very large effect on the people? How long do you think it took them before they reset the tables of the money changers, before they went and gathered their animals and brought them all back in to the place where they were before? 20 minutes? Maybe an hour? So what do we learn from such an event as this? Well, I think the first thing we learn is there aren't too many people that are concerned about Jesus in this world. First of all, we learn something very key about Jesus. He is serious about us seeking him and about worship. He's serious about you and I having this opportunity to be before him, to worship in truth, so that he can reveal himself in all his glory. He would want us to eliminate all the distractions. So many times people think, if I just show up to church, isn't that good enough? The answer is a resounding no. Unlike our politically correct culture, Jesus doesn't give participation trophies for just showing up in church. We learn a second thing about him. Jesus isn't going to tolerate any hypocrisy. That is, when we're just acting like we really love him and we're committed to him when we're not. Gospel accounts are full of Jesus responding to the Pharisees for their hypocrisy. He detests fakes and hypocrisy. What he wants is a real relationship, not something shallow that means nothing to us in the end, something that we throw by the wayside at a moment's notice. So secondly, he's not going to tolerate hypocrisy. And thirdly, you see there, not only is he merciful and loving, we saw that just before, if you'd read the text, he was at the wedding at Cana. He turns the water into wine. He's merciful, he's loving, but he's also holy and just. The writer of Hebrews describes Jesus this way. He says, strive for peace with everyone and for holiness, without which no one will see the Lord. That's Hebrews 12:14, by the way, without which no one will see the Lord, without holiness. So let me be really clear here today, and in this season of Lent, I want to be crystal clear. I'm overjoyed that we're gathered here as a body of the church, a church body, a faithful family when we're gathered here. But this does not usher you into heaven. The only thing that gets you into heaven, again, is the grace upon your life that God gives you as a sinner to make you righteous before him. What does it mean? It means that we got to know him personally. It means we come to him. We confess our sins before him. And then we ask him to come inside, to be all around us until the point where he has taken control and made a new you, taken a person that loves sin, he turns us into a person who does battle with sin. And I don't want us to think for a second that this has anything to do with a scale. You got more of your good deeds on one side than then your bad deeds on the other side and your good deeds outweigh your bad deeds. Nothing like that whatsoever. You could be the nicest person in the room and still not know him. Without holiness, no one will see the Lord. That's what Jesus is interested in when he goes to the temple. He wants reverence. He wants respect. That's what it's all about. You and me coming before the Lord. And if you're back in John, if you were in the early chapters, in chapter 1 specifically, this describes it so well. It says, "For the law was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ." Grace and truth. At the wedding at Cana and places like this, we see Jesus' grace. He's wonderful. He's gracious. At the temple, we see his truth. In other words, what's he saying here? If I dare so to put it in this way, saying, don't take me for granted. And don't take the relationship you have with me for granted. This grieves the Lord and brings him to holy and righteous anger. Okay? Clearly he's angry, but he's not out of control. He drives out the animals. He doesn't assault the handlers, notice, in his anger. He doesn't punch out the money changers, but he cleanses his Father's house, displaying righteous anger. Interesting. So fascinating, so interesting. His anger is triggered by the fact that when you and I are not the people he created us to be, that triggers his anger. Who are we created to be? And that's where Paul gives us the answer. 1 Corinthians 6, verses 19 and 20. You can jot that down. And I hope you look it up. Paul writes and says, "Or do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit within you, whom you have from God? You're not your own, for you were bought. You were bought with a price. So glorify God in your body." And look, just as Jesus came, he was the refiner. Remember that Malachi 3 tells us that he cleansed the temple. Does he need to do that to your life as well? Because he comes in grace and truth. He comes bringing grace, but he wants truth. He doesn't want games. Again, he doesn't want half love, half-hearted commitment. He wants people dedicated to him and him alone. Is that you? If not, I would suggest this, and this is what I'm going to leave you with. It would be your task and my task as we journey toward the cross with Jesus prior to celebrating the triumph of his resurrection. Take the time. Humbly invite the Lord to take you where he wants you to go, because in the end, we know this. We all know we can't fool him. We all need to face the truth about ourselves and surrender it. Just give it up. Just surrender it to the Lord for cleansing so that we can begin to understand the depth of his grace and then share it passionately with others. Amen. Hello, I'm Pastor Kent Hollis. I hope this message was meaningful to you and touched your heart in some way. We encourage you to check out our website at sjlcmetro.com. That's sjlcmetro.com. You can get further information regarding our ministry here at St. John Lutheran Church. And may the Lord bless you richly as you seek to be in relationship with him.